Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. Okay, welcome back everyone. You're listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm Michael Clogs, and I'm your host for today. And first off, we're going to go back to gun violence, and there have been more shootings. This time there was one in Texas, and there's also was a case in British Columbia where a woman who was actually trying to save her friend from killing himself with a gun was shot in the face. And the question becomes, where do we go with gun control? Where do we go? How do we actually teach this? And there are some things that are going to be brought up by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris about some of the things that are actually on the market that that can be created into a quote-unquote killing machine, so that you can buy a kit and it not actually be registered or have no serial numbers or anything for law enforcement to trace back. And how does that play into criminal activity, and how does that play into someone being able to hurt another person without consequence? So let's listen to what was said in the U.S. About gun control and these particular ways of being able to buy a gun that may not be so traceable and may be able to get around the idea of background checks and gun registration, so that we can, as a society, know who's doing what to who. Alright, so let's listen to what was actually said in this particular announcement about gun control in the United States.
Good morning. Over the course of my career, I have seen gun violence up close. I've looked at autopsy photographs. I've seen with my own two eyes what a bullet can do to the human body. I've held hands with the hands of parents who have lost a child. I have seen children who were traumatized by the loss of a parent or sibling. And I have fought my entire career to end this violence and to pass reasonable gun safety laws. Time and again, as progress has stalled, we have all asked, what are we waiting for? Because we aren't waiting for a tragedy, I know that. We've had more tragedy than we can bear. We aren't waiting for solutions either, because the solutions exist. They already exist. People on both sides of the aisle want action. Real people on both sides of the aisle want action. So all that is left is the will and the courage to act. And President Joe Biden has the will and the courage to act. As a United States Senator, Joe Biden took on the gun lobby not once but twice, and he won. In 1993, he worked to pass the Brady Handgun Violation Prevention Act. This law established a background check system and has kept more than 3 million firearms out of the hands of dangerous people. A year later, he worked to pass another law to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines for 10 years. And as Vice President, Joe Biden led the Obama-Biden administration's efforts to reduce gun violence. In fact, we were just reminiscing that he and I talked back then about his work because I was Attorney General at the time of California. And his work resulted in nearly 24 actions, from narrowing the gun show loophole to expanding funding for mental health services. And as you will hear in a moment, President Joe Biden is a leader with great will, great determination, and even greater empathy. He has seen the grief of all of those who have lost a loved one to gun violence. It is for them, for all of us, that he will never, ever give up on this fight. And it is now my great honor to introduce the President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Thank you, Kamala, Madam Vice President. Thank you very much. You know, we're joined today by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who I've asked to prioritize gun violence. It's also good to see the second gentleman who is here, and it's good to see the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, who cares deeply about this issue as well. And I look out there and I see so many members of Congress who've led in this fight, so many of you who've never given up, so many of you are absolutely determined, as Murphy and others are, to get this done. We got a long way to go. It seems like we always have a long way to go. But also today we're taking steps to confront not just the gun crisis, but what is actually a public health crisis. Nothing I'm about to recommend in any way impinges on the Second Amendment. They're phony arguments suggesting that these are Second Amendment rights at stake from what we're talking about. But no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater and call it freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted to own. From the very beginning the Second Amendment existed, certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. So the idea is just bizarre to suggest that some of the things we're recommending are contrary to the Constitution. Gun violence in this country is an epidemic. Let me say it again. Gun violence in this country is an epidemic, and it's an international embarrassment. You know, we saw it again last night as I was coming to the Oval Office. I got the word that in South Carolina, a physician with his wife, 2 grandchildren, and a person working at his house was gunned down, all 5. So many of the people sitting here today know that well, unfortunately. You know, they know what it's like when the seconds change your life forever. I've had the pleasure of getting to meet in awful circumstances many of you who've lost your children, your husbands, your wives. You know, they know what it's like to bury a piece of their soul deep in the earth. We understand that. Mark and Jackie, I want to tell you, it's always good to see you, but not under these circumstances. I want to say, before I introduce the rest of the folks, is, you know, what a lot of people have not been through, what they've been through, don't understand. It takes a lot of courage to come to an event like this. They're absolutely determined to make change. But Mark and Jackie, whose son Daniel was a first grader in Sandy Hook Elementary School, are Daniel loves sports, loves outdoor sports, getting muddy. I see my friend, Fred Gutenberg. His daughter, Jamie, was a freshman at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. She was an accomplished dancer. I see Brandon Wolf, who was the shooting at the Impulse, at the Pulse Club, nightclub. He survived, but his two best friends died. Greg Jackson, who was just walking down the street when he was caught in crossfire of a gunfight. And of course, I see a close friend of Jill's and mine, Congresswoman Gabby Gifford, who is here, who was speaking with her constituents in front of a grocery store in her state when she was shot and a member of her staff was killed. You know, they're here, and their pain is immense. And you know, what a lot of you, hopefully many of you, don't know is you've gone through a trauma. No matter how much you work to make sure others don't go through it, every time you show up at an event like this, it brings back when you got that phone call. It brings back the immediacy of what happened at that moment. So I genuinely mean it. Thank you. Thank you for having the courage to be here, the courage to continue this fight. Senator Blumenthal understands it. A lot of the folks out here understand it. But it takes real courage, so thank you. To turn pain into purpose and demand that we take the action that gives meaning to the word enough. Enough, enough, enough. Because what they want you to know, what they want you to do is not just listen. Every day in this country, 316 people are shot every single day. 106 of them die every day. Our flag was still flying at half-staff for the victims of the horrific murder of 8 primarily Asian American people in Georgia, when 10 more lives were taken in a mass murder in Colorado. You probably didn't hear it, but between those two incidents, less than 1 week apart, there were more than 850 additional shootings. 850 that took the lives of more than 250 people and left 500 injured. This is an epidemic, for God's sake, and it has to stop. So I'm here to talk about two things. First, the steps we're going to take immediately, and second, the action that needs to be taken going forward to curb the epidemic of gun violence. I asked the Attorney General and his team to identify for me immediate, concrete actions I could take now without having to go through the Congress. And today I'm announcing several initial steps my administration is taking to curb this epidemic of gun violence. Much more need to be done, but the first, want to rein in the proliferation of so-called ghost guns. These are guns that are homemade, built from a kit, that include directions on how to finish the firearm. You can go buy the kit. They have no serial numbers, so when they show up at a crime scene, they can't be traced. And the buyers aren't required to pass a background check to buy the kit, to make the gun. Consequently, anyone from a criminal to a terrorist can buy this kit in as little as 30 minutes, put together a weapon. You know, I want to see these kits treated as firearms under the Gun Control Act, which is going to require that the seller and manufacturers make the key parts with serial numbers and run background checks on the buyers when they walk in to buy that package. The second action we're going to take, back in the year 2000, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms released a report on its investigations of firearms trafficking in America. The report was of pivotal value. It was an important tool for policymakers when I was in the Senate and beyond, at all levels, to stop firearms from being illegally diverted into dangerous hands. Today, with online sales and ghost guns, times and trafficking methods have changed, and we have to adjust. we also have to ask the Justice Department to release a new annual report. This report will better help policymakers address firearms trafficking as it is today, not what it was yesterday. The third change, we want to treat pistols modified with stabilizing braces with the seriousness they deserve. A stabilizing brace shook on a pencil essentially makes that pistol a hell of a lot more accurate than a mini rifle. As a result, it's more lethal, effectively turning it into a short-barreled rifle. That's what the alleged shooter in Boulder appears to have done. I want to be clear that these modifications to firearms that make them more lethal should be subject to the National Firearms Act. The National Firearms Act requires that a potential owner pay $200 fee and submit their name and other identifying information to the Justice Department, just as they would if they went out and purchased a silencer for a gun. Fourthly, during my campaign for president, I wanted to make it easier for states to adopt extreme risk protection order laws. They're also called red flag laws, which everybody in this lawn knows, but many people listening do not know. These laws allow a police or family member to petition a court in their jurisdiction and say, I want you to temporarily remove from the following people any firearm they may possess because they're a danger and a crisis. They're presenting a danger to themselves and to others. And the court makes a ruling. To put this in perspective, more than half of all suicides, for example, involve the use of a firearm. But when a gun's not available, an attempt at suicide, the death rate drops precipitously. States that have red flag laws have seen a reduction in the number of suicides in their states. Every single month, by the way, an average of 53 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. I wrote the Violence Against Women Act. It's been a constant struggle to keep it moving. We know red flag laws can have significant effect in protecting women from domestic violence. And we know red flag laws can stop mass shooters before they can act out their violent plans. I'm proud, excuse the point of personal privilege we used to say in the Senate, I'm proud that the red flag law in my home state of Delaware was named after my son, Attorney General Bo Biden, our son, excuse me, Joe, who proposed that legislation back in 2013. I want to see a national red flag law and legislation to incentivize states to enact their own red flag laws. Today, I asked the Justice Department to publish a model red flag legislation so states can start crafting their own laws right now. Just like with background checks, the vast majority of the Americans support these extreme risk protection order laws. And it's time to put these laws on the books and protect even more people. The Attorney General will have more to say about this in a moment. Additionally, we recognize that cities across the country are experiencing historic spikes in homicides, as the law enforcement can tell you. The violence is hitting black and brown communities the hardest. Homicide is the leading cause of death of black boys and men ages 15 to 34. The leading cause of death. But there are proven strategies that reduce gun violence in urban communities. And there are programs that have demonstrated they can reduce homicides by up to 60% in urban communities. But many of these have been badly underfunded or not funded at all of late. Gun violence in America, for those of you who think of this from an economic standpoint listening to me, estimated to cost the nation $280 billion, let me say it again, $280 billion a year. You say, how could that be, Joe? Hospital bills, physical therapy, trauma counseling, legal fees, prison costs, and the loss of productivity. Not to mention the psychological damage done to the children who live in these cities, watching this happen, knowing someone it happened to. This gun violence in our neighborhood is having profound impact on our children, even if they're never involved in pulling the trigger or being the victim of on the other side of it. For a fraction of the cost of gun violence, we can save lives, create safe and healthy communities, and build economies that work for all of us, and save billions of American dollars. In the meantime, much of it, as Senator Cicilline knows, is taxpayer money. Finally, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the key agency enforcing gun laws, hasn't had a permanent director since 2015. Today, I'm proud to nominate David Chipman to serve as the director of the AFT. David knows the AFT well. He served there for 25 years. And Vice President Harris and I believe he's the right person at this moment for this important agency. And I've said before, my job, the job of any president, is to protect the American people. Whether Congress acts or not, I'm going to use all the resources at my disposal as president to keep the American people safe from gun violence. But there's much more that Congress can do to help that effort. And they can do it right now. They've offered plenty of thoughts and prayers, members of Congress, but they've passed not a single new federal law to reduce gun violence. Enough prayers. Time for some action. I believe the Senate should immediately pass 3 House-passed bills to close loopholes that allow gun purchasers to bypass the background checks. The vast majority of the American people, including gun owners, believe there should be background checks before you purchase a gun. As was noted earlier, hundreds of thousands of people have been denied guns because of the background checks. What more would have happened? These bills, one, require background checks for anyone purchasing a gun at a gun show or an online sale. Most people don't know it. You walk into a store and you buy a gun, you have a background check. But you go to a gun show, you can buy whatever you want and no background check. Second thing is to close what's known as the Charleston loophole. Like people here, I spent time down at that church in Charleston. What happened is someone was allowed to get the gun used to kill those innocent people at the church service. If the FBI didn't complete the background check within 3 days, there's a process. If it wasn't done in 3 days, according to the Charleston loophole, you get to buy the gun. They bought the gun and killed a hell of a lot of innocent people who invited him to pray with them. And 3, reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, which is so-called close the boyfriend and stalking loopholes to keep guns out of the hands of people found by a court to be an abuser and continuing threat. I held over 1,000 hours of hearings to pass the Violence Against Women Act. And one thing came through. If, in fact, a stay-away order, an order preventing the abuser from coming in a certain distance of the person he has abused or she has abused, and now the idea that they can own a weapon when they have a court order saying they are an abuser, these are some of the best tools we have right now to prevent gun violence and save lives. But all these bills, they had support of both Democrats and Republicans in the House. And universal background checks are supported by the vast majority of the American people. And I might add, the vast majority of responsible gun owners. So let me be clear. This is not a partisan issue among the American people. This is a view by the American people as an American issue. And I'm willing to work with anyone to get these done. And it's long past time that we act. Now, I know this has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. Got it done once. We should also ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country. For that 10 years we had it done, the number of mass shootings actually went down. Even law enforcement officials have told me and told other champions of this legislation they sometimes feel outgunned by assault weapons with large capacity magazines. There's no reason someone needs a weapon of war with 100 rounds, 100 bullets that can be fired from that weapon. Nobody needs that. Nobody needs that. We got that done when I was a United States Senator. It wasn't easy going up against the gun lobby, but it saved lives. And we should also eliminate gun manufacturers from the immunity they receive from the Congress. You realize, again, the people here, because they're so knowledgeable on here in the Rose Garden, but most people don't realize the only industry in America, a billion-dollar industry, that can't be sued, has exempt from being sued, are gun manufacturers. Imagine how different it would be had that same exemption been available to tobacco companies who knew and lied about the danger they were causing, the cancer caused and the like. Imagine where we'd be. But this is the only outfit that is exempt from being sued. If I get one thing on my list, the Lord came down and said, Joe, you get one of these, give me that one. Because I tell you what, there would be a come to the Lord moment these folks would have real quickly. But they're not. They're not. They're exempt. I know that the conversation about guns in this country can be a difficult one. But even here, there's much more common ground than anyone would believe. There's much more common ground. Everything that's being proposed today is totally consistent with the Second Amendment. And there's a wide consensus behind the need to take action. I know that when overwhelming majorities of Americans want to see something change that will affect their lives, and it still doesn't change, it can be demoralizing to our fellow citizens. It can feel like our entire political process is broken. I know it's painful and frustrating that we haven't made the progress that we'd hoped for. But it took 5 years to get Brady Bill passed, and it took even more years to work to pass the assault weapons ban. And it saved lives. No matter how long it takes, we're going to get these passed. We're not going to give up. We have an opportunity to fulfill the first responsibility of government, to keep our people safe. And in the process, we can show the world and show ourselves that democracy works. And we can come together and get big things done. When I look around and see such brave survivors sitting out here in the Rose Garden, public servants who devoted their lives to dealing with this, advocates who feel strongly and are pushing every day to make the rational changes, and courageous parents and family members, I know the progress, even in this most difficult of issues, is possible. So, folks, this is just the start. We got a lot of work to do, but I know almost every one of you sitting in the garden here, none of you ever given up. We're not going to give up now. The idea that we have so many people dying every single day from gun violence in America is a blemish on our character as a nation. Let me say to all of you, God bless you, but most importantly, the memory of all many of you have lost to the senseless gun violence. And now I'd like to...
Okay, so staying with President Biden and the United States, there's more statements that Joe Biden has made about the American Jobs Bill and infrastructure and how important it is to keep up with, not only to build a strong infrastructure, but to to ensure that that infrastructure is maintained and that it keeps up with the needs of the people at hand. So let's hear more of what was said about the American Jobs Plan and infrastructure.
Good afternoon, everyone. Last week in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I announced my plan to rebuild what I refer to as the backbone of America through the American Jobs Plan. It's not a plan that tinkers around the edges. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America, unlike anything we've done since we built the interstate highway system and won the space race decades ago. It's the single largest investment in American jobs since World War II. And it's a plan that puts millions of Americans to work to fix what's broken in our country. Tens of thousands of miles of roads and highways, thousands of bridges in desperate need of repair. But it also is a blueprint for infrastructure needed for tomorrow, not just yesterday, tomorrow. For American jobs, for American competitiveness. Last week, I said that once Congress is back from recess, I'd get to work right away because we have no time to lose. So here we are. Democrats and Republicans will have ideas about what they like and what they don't like about our plan. That's a good thing. That's the American way. That's the way democracy works. Debate is welcome. Compromise is inevitable. Changes are certain. In the next few weeks, the Vice President and I will be meeting with Republicans and Democrats to hear from everyone. And we'll be listening. We'll be open to good ideas and good faith negotiations. But here's what we won't be open to. We will not be open to doing nothing. Inaction simply is not an option. Now, since I announced this plan, I've heard from my Republican friends say that many of them say it's too big. They say, why not focus on traditional infrastructure? Fix what we've already got, the roads and the highways that exist and the bridges. I'm happy to have that debate, but I want to tell you my view. We are America. We don't just fix for today. We build for tomorrow. 200 years ago, trains weren't traditional infrastructure either, until America made a choice to lay down tracks across the country. Highways weren't traditional infrastructure, until we allowed ourselves to imagine that roads could connect our nation across state lines. The idea of infrastructure has always evolved to meet the aspirations of the American people and their needs, and it's evolving again today. We need to start seeing infrastructure through its effect on the lives of working people in America. What is the foundation today that they need to carve out their place in the middle class, to make it, to live, to go to work, to raise their families with dignity, to ensure that good jobs will be there for their kids, no matter who they are or what zip code they live in? That's what infrastructure means in the 21st century. It still depends on roads and bridges, ports and airports, rail and mass transit. But it also depends on having reliable, high-speed internet in every home. Because today's high-speed internet is infrastructure. It depends on the electric grid, a grid that won't collapse in a winter storm or be compromised by hackers at home or abroad. It depends on investing in made-in-America goods from every American community, including those that have historically been left out: Black, Latino, Asian American, Native Americans, rural communities. Talk to folks around the country about what really makes up the foundation of a good economy. Ask a teacher or a child care worker if having clean drinking water, non-contaminated drinking water in our schools and our child care centers is part of that foundation. When we know that the lead in our pipes slows a child's development when they drink that water. Ask the entrepreneur whose small business was destroyed by the second 100-year flood in the last 10 years in Iowa. Or wildfires in the West that burned 5 million acres last year, an area roughly the size of the entire state of New Jersey. More fires than ever. Or the devastating damage seen more frequent and more intense hurricanes and storms on the east and Gulf coasts. Ask all those farmers and small business owners and homeowners whether investing in clean energy to fight the effects of climate change is part of infrastructure. Ask folks in rural America, where more than 35% of the people lack a reliable high-speed internet, limiting their ability to conduct business or engage in remote learning for their schools. Ask them whether investing in internet access will lead to better jobs in town, new markets for farmers, and better opportunities for their kids. And I'm serious about this. Ask the moms and dads in the sandwich generation, the folks carrying enormous personal and financial strains trying to raise their children and care for their parents, their elderly parents, or members of their families with a disability. Ask them what sort of infrastructure they need to build a little better life, to be able to breathe a little bit. It's expanded services for seniors. It's home care workers who go in and cook their meal, help them get around and live independently in their home, allowing them to stay in their homes, and I might add, saving Medicaid hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. It's better wages and benefits and opportunities for caregivers who are disproportionately women, women of color, and immigrants. Or ask our wounded warriors and military families. To my Republican colleagues in Congress, shouldn't we modernize VA hospitals? Update them? Many of them are more than 50 years old. How about the estimate 450,000 post-9/11 veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, who when they make that emergency call, or their husband, wife, son, daughter makes that call to the VA hospital, Dad needs help, we have to bring him in. And they hear, you have to wait. We don't have room now. Come back, call me back in 8 days, 10 days, 12 days. Look at the more suicides in the military than people getting shot. Is it really your position, my friends, that our veterans don't deserve the most modern facilities that could catch that cancer diagnosis quicker, with access to better roads, cleaner water, high-speed internet that delivers information faster and more of it? Above all, infrastructure is about meeting the needs of a nation and putting Americans to work and being able to do and get paid for having good jobs. Plumbers and pipe fitters, replacing those literally thousands of miles of dangerous lead pipes. They're still out there. Everybody remembers what happened in Flint. There's hundreds of Flints all across America. How many of you know when you send your child to school, the fountain they're drinking out of is not fed by a lead pipe? How many of you know the school your child is in still has asbestos in the walls and lacks the ventilation? Is that not infrastructure? Line workers and electricians laying transmission lines for a modern grid, providing over 500,000 charging stations on the highways we are going to build to accommodate electric vehicles so we can own the future. Construction workers and engineers building modern hospitals and homes for American families. Healthcare workers, steel workers, folks who work in the cutting-edge labs. Nearly 90% of the infrastructure jobs created by our American Jobs Plan can be filled by people who don't have a college degree. 75% don't need an associate's degree. As I said last week, This is a blue-collar blueprint for increasing opportunity for the American people. It also includes the biggest investment in non-defense research and development on record. I promise you, it's not part of my speech, but I promise you, you're all going to be reporting over the next 6 to 8 months how China and the rest of the world is racing ahead of us in the investments they have in the future, attempting to own the future, the technology, quantum computing, investing significant amounts of money in dealing with cancer and Alzheimer's. That's the infrastructure of a nation. There's a new book out about how we've fallen behind. America is no longer the leader of the world because we're not investing. It used to be we invested almost 2.7% of our GDP in infrastructure. Now it's about 0.7%. When we were investing it, we were the leader in the world. I don't know why we don't get this. One of a few major economies in the world whose public investment in research and development has declined as a percentage of GDP in the last 25 years. Declined. The United States of America, that led the world. Why does this matter? Investing in research and development helped lead to lithium batteries, LED technology, the internet itself. It helped lead to vaccine breakthroughs that are helping us beat COVID-19, to the Human Genome Project, which has led to breakthroughs in how we understand and fight cancer and other diseases. Government, meaning the taxpayers, funded this research. Government. When we stop investing in research, we stop investing in the jobs of the future, and we give up leading the world. When we do invest in research, what we're really doing is raising the bar on what we can imagine. Imagine a world where you and your family can travel coast to coast without a single tank of gas, or in a high-speed train close to as fast as you can go across the country in a plane. Imagine your children growing up to work in innovation, good-paying jobs in fields that haven't even been invented yet, like the parents of every computer programmer, every graphic designer, every renewable energy worker once did, imagined. We invest today so that these jobs will be here in America tomorrow. So America can lead the world as is historically done. That's why I brought back scientists into the White House. We need to think. Look, do we think the rest of the world is waiting around? We're not going to make those kind of investments the rest of the world is saying. Take a look. Do you think China is waiting around to invest in this digital infrastructure or in research and development? I promise you, they are not waiting. But they're counting on American democracy to be too slow, too limited, and too divided to keep pace. You've heard me say it before. I think this generation can be marked by the competition between democracies and autocracies, because the world is changing so rapidly. The autocrats are betting on democracy not being able to generate the kind of unity needed to make decisions to get in that race. We can't afford to prove them right. We have to show the world. Much more importantly, we have to show ourselves that democracy works, that we can come together on the big things. This is the United States of America, for God's sake. Of course, building the infrastructure of tomorrow requires major investments today. As I said last week, I'm open to ideas about how to pay for this plan, with one exception. I will not impose any tax increases on people making less than $400,000 a year. If others have ideas out there on how to pay for this investment without violating that rule, they should come forward. There's all kinds of opportunities. Just list all the tax breaks that I find difficult to explain. Wealthy deductions, $360 billion if you cap them, top rate of 39%, which it used to be for years, all the way to the Bush administration, almost $250 billion, corporate minimum tax, and the fossil fuel giveaways of $40 billion, et cetera. I could go on. But let me tell you what I proposed, how to do it. We're going to raise the corporate tax rate. It was 35% for the longest time, which was too high. Barack and I thought it was too high during our administration. We all agreed 5 years ago that it should come down somewhat. But the previous administration reduced it all the way down to 21%. What I'm proposing is that we meet in the middle, 28%. 28% would still have lower corporate rates than any time between World War II and 2017. It will generate over $1 trillion in taxes over 15 years. New independent study put out last week found that at least 55 of our largest corporations use the various loopholes to pay zero federal income tax in 2020. It's just not fair. It's not fair to the rest of the American taxpayers. We're going to try to put an end to this. Not fleece them. 28%. If you're a mom and dad, a cop, firefighter, police officer, et cetera, you're paying close to that in your income tax. I've also proposed the global minimum tax, which is being proposed around the world, for U.S. corporations at 21%. Let me tell you what that means. It means that companies aren't going to be able to hide their income in places like the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, in tax havens. We're going to also eliminate deductions used by corporations for offshoring jobs and shifting assets overseas. They offshore the jobs, shift the assets overseas, and then don't have to pay taxes on all they make there. And we'll significantly ramp up IRS enforcement against corporations and the super wealthy who either fail to report their income or underreport it. Estimated that would raise tens of billions of dollars. It adds up to more than what I proposed in just 15 years. It's honest, it's fair, it's fiscally responsible, and it pays for what we need and reduces the debt over the long haul. And by the way, I didn't hear any of our friends who were criticizing this plan say that the corporate tax cut, which added $2 trillion of the debt, the Trump tax cut, $1.9 trillion in debt, wasn't paid for. The vast majority of which went to the top 1% of the wage earners. I didn't hear anybody hollering in this recovery, the so-called, before I became president, this K-shaped recovery, where billionaires made $300 billion more during this period. Where's the outrage there? I'm not trying to punish anybody, but damn it, maybe it's because I come from a middle-class neighborhood. I'm sick and tired of ordinary people being fleeced. Let me close by saying this. Whatever partisan divisions there are around other issues, there don't have to be around this one. The divisions of the moment shouldn't stop us from doing the right thing for the future. These aren't Republican bridges, Democratic airports, Republican hospitals, or Democratic power grid. Think of the Transcontinental Railroad, the interstate highway system, or the space race. We're one nation, united and connected. As I said last week, I'm going to bring Republicans to the White House. I invite them to come. We'll have good faith negotiations, and any Republican who wants to get this done, I invite them. We have to get these things done. We're at an inflection point in American democracy. This is a moment where we prove whether or not democracy can deliver, whether it can lay the foundation for an economy built from the bottom up and the middle out, not trickle-down economics from the very top, whether it can lay a good foundation for good jobs in the 21st century economy. I tell the kids, the young people who work for me, told my kids, when I go on college campuses, they're going to see more change in the next 10 years than we've seen in the last 50 years. We're going to talk about commercial aircraft flying at subsonic speeds, supersonic speeds. Be able to figuratively, if we decided to do it, traverse the world in about an hour, travel 21,000 miles an hour. So much is changing. We have got to lead it. I believe democracy can come through when the American people come together. We saw it in the American Rescue Plan. We're seeing it with the Jobs Plan. The American Rescue Plan, which got so badly criticized, how many of my Republican colleagues you've seen gone on your stations or your newspapers and say, boy, people in my state really like it? Because it would be improper, I haven't asked permission. The number of Republicans and Democrats who were hesitant have called me saying, God, this really works. Overwhelming majority of the American people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, support infrastructure investments that meets the moment. So I urge the Congress, listen to your constituents, and together we can lay a foundation for an economy that works for everyone and allows America to remain the world leader. When we do that, I believe, as I said last week, that in 50 years from now, when people look back, they'll say, this was the moment together that we won America's future. I really believe that. Thank you all.
So this week we had World Health Day, and during, of course, this global pandemic, World Health Day takes on a completely new meaning, where the question is, how do we join together as a global community to make sure that health of every person on our planet right now can maintain their health? How do we make that health care affordable, equal to everyone on our planet? And with the pandemic on, we found holes, we found gaps in even within the North American society, how things were not even equal just for our elders to those who are still working. To those who have to go to work every day and report to a job site every day, how unequal it was between those and those who may have had a job where they could report to that same job on a virtual basis. So we've seen a lot of inequities, and on World Health Day, maybe some of those inequities could be resolved. So I'm going to play next bits from the WHO the day before World Health Day, and we're going to listen to PAHO, the Pan-American Health Organization, on World Health Day, and see what the leaders and directors of these groups have been doing to ensure global health.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Tomorrow is World Health Day. COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities both between and within countries. While we have all undoubtedly been impacted by the pandemic, the poorest and most marginalized have been hit hardest, both in terms of lives and livelihoods lost. In the year ahead, the world needs to make 5 vital changes. First, we need to invest in equitable production and access to COVID-19 rapid tests, oxygen treatments, and vaccines between and within countries. At the start of the year, I made a call for every country to start vaccinating health workers and older people in the first 100 days of 2021. This week will mark the 100th day, and 190 countries and economies have now started vaccination. COVAX itself has already delivered 36 million doses to 86 countries and economies. Supply chains are up and running and health systems primed. Scaling up production and equitable distribution remains the major barrier to ending the acute stage of this pandemic. It is a travesty that in some countries health workers and those at-risk groups remain completely unvaccinated. The effort to achieve vaccine equity will not stop this week. WHO will continue to call on governments to share vaccine doses and fill the $22.1 billion gap in the ACT Accelerator for the equitable distribution of vaccines, rapid tests, and therapeutics. We will also look to find new ways to work with manufacturers to boost overall vaccine production. This month, individuals around the world will also be able to get involved in accelerating vaccine equity via a new fundraising campaign. Developed by the WHO Foundation and a range of partners, the campaign will enable individuals and companies to get one, give one, and close the overall COVID-19 vaccine gap. Further updates will be shared around the launch. Second, there must be a serious investment in primary health care and getting health services to every member of every community. The pandemic has exposed the fragility of our health systems. As essential services were paused, many diseases came roaring back. At least half of the world's population still lacks access to essential health services, and out-of-pocket expenses on health drive almost 100 million people into poverty each year. As countries move forward post-COVID-19, it will be vital to avoid cuts in public spending on health and other social sectors. Such cuts are likely to increase hardship among already disadvantaged groups. They will weaken health system performance, increase health risks, add to fiscal pressure in the future, and undermine development gains. Instead, governments should meet WHO's recommended target of spending an additional 1% of GDP on primary health care, which is central to improving both equity and efficiency. And they must reduce the global shortfall of 18 million health workers needed to achieve universal health coverage by 2030. Third, prioritize health and social protection. Some countries have already put in place expanded social protection schemes to mitigate the negative impact of the pandemic on poverty, education, nutrition, and overall health. These schemes should be extended until essential services are up and running again. And they must include marginalized groups in planning and implementing future schemes. Fourth, build safe, healthy, and inclusive neighborhoods. City leaders have often been powerful champions for better health, for example, by improving transport systems and water and sanitation facilities. Access to healthy housing in safe neighborhoods is key to achieving health for all. But too often, the lack of basic social services for some communities traps them in a spiral of sickness and insecurity. That must change. Meanwhile, 80% of the world's populations living in extreme poverty are in rural areas where 7 out of 10 people lack access to basic sanitation and water services. So countries must intensify efforts to reach rural communities with health and other basic social services. Finally, data and health information systems must be enhanced. High quality and timely disaggregated data by sex, wealth, education, ethnicity, race, gender, and place of residence is key to working out where inequities exist and addressing them. Health inequality monitoring has to be an integral part of all national and health information systems. At present, just half the world's countries have any capacity to do this. Today, I'm happy to welcome 4 heads of state and government to talk about health equity and changes they have made to achieve it. First, Her Excellency, Prime Minister Maya Motley of Barbados will start proceedings, and I'm keen to hear of Barbados' experience in the last year and the way ahead. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Prime Minister, we don't hear your sound, please.
Thank you very much, my brother Dr. Tedros. Your Excellency Hage Geingob, President of Namibia, who I have not seen since Nairobi in December 2019. We didn't expect the last year. And to my other brother, Your Excellency Carlos Alvarado Quesada, we spoke a couple months ago, and equally we didn't expect that this journey would be as long as it is. President also, Aliyev, I want to say how pleasant it is this morning for me to join you, because 73 years ago, tomorrow, the World Health Organization would have been formed, and therefore the commemoration of this day through World Health Day is most appropriate. It would have been appropriate in any scenario, but more relevant and more critical at this point. In the Caribbean, we love our proverbs, short, clever phrases packed with the knowledge to last a lifetime, and I suspect those in Africa are the people from whom we've gotten that love of proverbs. One favorite amongst us, and especially our school teachers in the region, was the one that simply said, Peter pays for Paul, and Paul pays for all. And I start here this morning because it is in the recognition that this is a collective battle that we will win the victory. We have come together globally to try and fight a pandemic, but we have to ask ourselves whether we did it in sufficient time and on sufficient scale. We have to ask ourselves whether the 5 priority actions being focused on this morning, equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and treatments, both within and between countries, is being achieved by the countries of the region and the countries of the world. In the Caribbean, our journey has been torturous over the last year. And Dr. Tedros, I know that you have tried to intervene on numerous occasions to assist us. But the bald reality is that our market size in many instances is simply too small to command the attention of global pharmaceutical companies or indeed of other suppliers of goods in the normal supply chain that will lead for therapeutics distribution, vaccine distribution. And the bottom line is that we have also separately been regarded by the global community as countries that have come out of the depths of poverty and therefore are not deserving of assistance in the traditional ways normally reserved for the most vulnerable. This has made life difficult. We've held on to the promise of COVAX, and I've come to you this morning having received the first tranche of Barbados's vaccines, 3% of our population, with respect to the COVID vaccines this morning. But for many globally, this has been a difficult exercise because as we've seen, the spikes can literally grow. We've not had access even when we are prepared to pay. It is against this background, therefore, that the first call to action of equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and treatments within and between countries is one with which we can relate. Secondly, the post-COVID-19 recovery budget and plans to protect and prioritize health and social sectors is one that is truly being felt by the majority of us. And why? The World Bank estimates that global GDP will fall by about 4% this year, with between 40 and 60 million people entering extreme poverty. But our reality also is, as a tourism and travel dependent country, the fall in our GDP last year was not 4%, was not 8%, was not even 12 or 16%. It was 18%, threatening to take our country back more than a decade as a result of the loss of production and productive capacity. Regrettably, we continue to be treated globally as one of those countries that is not deserving to concessional capital, even as we face the most difficult crisis that we have faced in a century. These are issues that I hope that the Development Committee of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that meets later this week, and I have the honor of chairing, will begin to start to put our case for the need to use different criteria for determining how countries should access serious concessional capital most needed now in order to stave off the worst aspects of this pandemic, but more importantly, to deal with the long-lasting consequences of the pandemic, which is the social and economic losses that have been sustained in the last decade. The third aspect of the call to action, equitable services and infrastructure in all communities, both urban and rural. This is absolutely critical, particularly for the larger countries in the region and globally. But even within a small country such as ours, we have recognized that there are differences and that part of the problem, particularly in the urban setting, is the density of housing that has existed in many instances pre-independence and post-independence, largely because most developing countries in the world have had a significantly broad agenda, reflected by many in the SDG agenda, but a significant broad development agenda that makes it difficult for us to have corrected all of the wrongs that we've needed to correct since independence. It means that in urban communities, the density and the exposure is far greater, regrettably, than in most, but equally in rural communities, the lack of access to available health care for larger countries, not so much small island developing states, but larger countries remains a major issue. Fourthly, the call to action looks at the issue of primary health care for everyone, everywhere. But I'd like to make the point that the Caribbean, more than most, has in the post-independence region, era, determined that for us to leave anyone behind is a travesty because our modern settlement was based on discrimination and exclusion, and therefore the reality and the imperative of inclusion as well as transparency are absolutely vital if we are to bring our people out of these difficult times in which we live. Finally, better data collection and reporting in countries so that we know where the health inequalities are and can address them. My friends, this will not be the last pandemic. There will not be the last one for us. History is replete with examples, and we have to determine what we will learn from our experience over the course of the last year. For many, the 1918-1920 Spanish flu pandemic is too far in the recesses of our recent memory such that we made fundamental mistakes that we should never allow anyone to make again. Dr. Tedros, you asked me to serve as the co-chair on the One Health Global Initiative, which we have dubbed the slow motion pandemic, because we fear that by 2050, more people will die from these superviruses that are antibiotics that we have and other medication are not allowing us to treat sufficiently. I pray that we will take in front, as we would say before, in front takes us. And what do I mean by that? That we will so sensitize the global population that the basic things that we need to take action, the basic policy instruments necessary to remove people from poverty or necessary to remove the juxtaposition of animal and humans in living conditions, not just working conditions, that have given rise to so many diseases that have caused so much death and so much concern in the world. If we do not get the fundamental development equation correct, if we do not work together, if we do not appreciate that we can only work together if we are to achieve a fairer and healthier world, then we run the risk of seeing millions of persons die again in circumstances where different policy responses or similar policy responses with different scale and different pace of execution can hopefully have a different result in ensuring that less and less people will become victims to awful epidemics and pandemics. They say politics is the art of repetition, and I said so this morning. Over the course of the last year, we have said the same thing more often than at any other time. There is no magic bullet, and there is no magic recipe. The answer is simply for us to work together to get that fairer world, and for there to be a level of global moral leadership, recognizing that the singular pursuit of individual countries will not rid the world of the major problems, because human beings cannot be contained behind boundaries easily in this globally interdependent world. I pray that we will, across the world, summon the courage to be able to have coordinated action, not just acting together, but coordinated action, such that we are in a position to be able to see the end of this pandemic, because we are acting collectively with shutdowns, we're acting collectively with protocols, we're acting collectively with the kinds of policy responses that we now know after a year are critical if we are to put this behind us. I thank the World Health Organization and all of its staff members, the Pan American Health Organization that serves us in this hemisphere, and all of its staff members for continuing to keep the battle on. But I recognize that the ball lies in the courts of the political will of member states of the global community. Thank you, and may we rise to that point where we summon the courage for that globally coordinated action to make a fairer, healthier world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency Prime Minister Motley. Moral leadership and coordinated action. I fully agree. Barbados' experience suppressing COVID-19 as well as investing in universal health coverage is an example for the region and the world. So thank you so much again. I will now turn to His Excellency President Carlos Alvarado of Costa Rica, who has been working closely with WHO on how to ensure that new health technologies are available in all countries through his idea, the setup which we have started implementing together. So President Alvarado, very nice to see you again, even if it's online, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tedros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tedros. My greetings to Your Excellency, Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, President Hage Geingob from Namibia, and to those who are joining us today at the press conference. Indeed, Dr. Tedros, the principles of CTAP, which is the technology for healthcare pool, It's continuing this year, 1 year after the start of this pandemic and 1 day before World Health Day. And this is linked to access to technologies or treatments in an equal and fair way for people throughout the world without any distinction. As Prime Minister Motley was saying, this has a great deal to do with moral leadership and with commitment to progress along this way. This pool can bring along technologies to make them available to all countries and all governments throughout the world. And as Dr. Tedros has said, we need to keep pushing for this. There's already a team set up within the WHO for this. So what we need is governments and the private sector to commit to making it a reality. The first point that was raised by the call of Dr. Tedros on equitable access, I'd like to mention two central subjects. One is linked to the strengthening of social security and universal healthcare in countries. In Costa Rica, it has been the strength of our universal healthcare system that has protected us, and this has ensured that we reduce the differences between those on higher and lower incomes, because we've ensured that anyone in any part of the country has the same access to testing, vaccine, treatment, and even to hospitalization, with no distinction on geography. This is difficult and it's expensive, but this is what makes a difference in a world that needs greater equality. And the pandemic, as Dr. Tedros has said, has increased inequalities between countries and within countries. And the inequalities also have an impact on health. Societies which are more unequal are societies which are most violent, and the most violent societies also bring about other phenomena such as migration or clearly the loss of human life. Another very important point in terms of equitable access is the drive that many countries are making for the international treaty for preparation and response to pandemics. Before COVID-19, the globalized world had not experienced such an impact in the effects of a pandemic, and we need to learn from this experience and be ready. And above all, being ready means being ready for coordinated action, and action in solidarity, which does not distinguish between greater or less development, greater or less wealth, whether one is in an urban or rural area. We hope that this treaty will achieve these principles, but we will also work to ensuring that the treaty includes principles such as those that we have used in CETUP. On the budgets for post-COVID recovery, it has remained clear that health is not just a matter of illness. Healthcare is an all-encompassing subject. We cannot take care of our populations if we don't have guarantees for budgets that provide support to the health sector, community sector, and to the infrastructure. It's so important that multilateral organizations can provide means of financing for poor countries, for emerging countries, and to assist them in facing up to the medium and long-term effects of the pandemic. Today, developed economies have managed to achieve special packages to help their countries to overcome the effects of COVID, but that's not something that poorer countries can do that. And the fact that there will not be a global recovery from COVID whilst the whole planet is not vaccinated. We won't see economic recovery in the planet if the whole world is not economically vaccinated. So it's extremely important that we look at the subject of financing, whether it's in debt forgiveness or financing in the long term with zero rates or stable rates of interest so that countries can have a margin for maneuver. And we also need to finance the development and public health, infrastructure and recovery. And so this is more than a subject of finance, it's one of health as well. That's why it's so important that we deal with this. Costa Rica has launched the FACE initiative to alleviate economics within the United Nations and also with ECLA to cover those funds to help emerging economies. And to give a specific case, the opinions of the qualifying agencies are not taking into account the efforts being made by governments to maintain stable economies and also to assist our populations. And every time that there's a negative qualification, that makes access to finance more expensive for our countries. We need to take into account the impact of COVID when countries are assessed, because we have to think about the effects of the pandemic on countries' economies. In terms of data collection and the assessment of data mentioned by the Director General, Costa Rica has a system which is the digital document where each citizen has their digital record, and that helps us to keep track of progress whilst maintaining the confidential nature for each citizen. But it helps us to have the management of this data so we can deal with this pandemic and future pandemics. And I'd also like to turn now to showing my gratitude to the WHO for all its work, and I'd like to thank Dr. Tedros and mention once more our support from Costa Rica and my support to ensure that treatment, diagnoses and vaccines arrive in an equitable and rapid manner to all those who need it. And once more, my greetings, Dr. Tedros.
COVID infections continue to surge throughout the Americas. Last week, we had more than 1.3 million new cases in our region and more than 37,000 deaths. In fact, more than half of all global deaths reported over the last week were in the Americas. A sober reminder of the human toll of this pandemic. The epidemiological situation across the region is uneven. Infections are rising in some places and falling in others. In North America, cases and hospitalizations are climbing in Canada, while infection rates are slowing down in the United States and Mexico. Just as cases are decelerating in Belize, El Salvador, and Panama, we are seeing a rise in new infections in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala. In the Caribbean, populous islands like Jamaica and the Dominican Republic are seeing a dip in cases, while infections are going up in smaller islands like Martinique, Bermuda, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But nowhere are infections as worrisome as in South America, where cases are mounting in nearly every country. In areas of Bolivia and Colombia, cases have doubled in the last week, and all 4 countries in the Southern Cone have been experiencing an acceleration in COVID-19 cases, with uninterrupted community transmission in recent weeks. In the meantime, ICU beds are nearing capacity in Peru and Ecuador. Over the last week, The United States, Brazil, and Argentina were among the 10 countries in the world registering the highest number of new infections worldwide, and other countries were not far behind. Driving down infections starts by staying home and doing everything that we can to protect ourselves and others from getting sick. And yet, we are seeing that populations in the region slowly and steadily increase their mobility over time, even when public health and social measures were in place during this pandemic. More people are traveling within and between countries, and if these trends continue, our health systems will be in deeper trouble. Regardless of pandemic fatigue, we cannot ease public health and social interventions without good data and justification. Our actions must reflect our reality. Slowing and then stopping transmission requires decisive action by local and national governments and the continuous vigilance from all of us. Today marks World Health Day, a day where we reflect on the importance of health and our promise to achieve health for all. With its theme of Together for a Fairer, Healthier World, there is no better moment to talk about the need for urgent change. Over the last year, this virus has greatly deepened the inequities that have long divided this region. While many of us have been lucky enough to continue working during the pandemic from the comfort and safety of home, half of our workforce relies on the informal economy. Staying at home would have meant foregoing their livelihoods. Many others remain or are newly unemployed. For them and the 22 million people who fell into poverty this year in our region, the financial strain of this pandemic has been devastating. Effectively fighting COVID-19 is impossible without addressing some of these inequalities and supporting the most vulnerable as they struggle to protect themselves. The good news is that vaccinations continue to move forward across our region. Today, more than 210 million doses of COVID vaccines have been administered across 49 countries and territories in the Americas. And thus far, PAHO's revolving fund has delivered more than 2.8 million COVID vaccines from the COVAX mechanism to 26 countries. And more than 300,000 doses are making their way to the Caribbean. But of course, vaccines are just one part of our COVID response, and we must continue to rely on public health measures to keep our populations and our countries safe. That's why PAHO has developed an interactive platform where countries can visualize the measures that were implemented and to compare that with how mobility has behaved over time. We can see peaks in mobility during specific periods such as Christmas, New Year's, Semana Santa. In addition, PAHO developed modeling tools to increase nowcasting and increasing those capacities at country level. Today, more than 15 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean are using this platform to inform their pandemic response, and we want to encourage others to follow suit. On World Health Day, we urge countries to make equity the guiding force of their COVID response. Countries must prioritize investments in health to keep people safe and healthy and economies strong. Health must be central to our efforts as we work to reduce inequality and to build more resilient societies. Every country, regardless of income, must make needed investments in their health systems and make healthcare more accessible to the poorest and most vulnerable. As we continue to fight this virus, we must do more than just stop COVID-19. We must commit to working together to build a fairer, healthier world. We must also take this opportunity to build a healthier region that's better prepared to tackle the next challenge and realizes our promise of health for all. Over.
Okay, so we heard Dr. Etienne talking about surging cases in the Americas. Of course, she's talking about both North and South America. And this next example of reported by the BC Public Health Office, in one day, a new surge of, or record surge of reported cases of COVID-19 and with variants is 1,293 cases. That was for one day, and they're now the public health office is also saying that there are delays in reporting back, and some of those delays may have affected the spread of infection. So they, of course, are working and speeding these things up, but with apps and everything, there have been delays in reporting to people that, hey, you could have been exposed, and what you need to do to actually ensure testing to see if you are in fact infected. Along with that, British Columbia has also issued orders to allow a safety organization for the province. They actually monitor and measure safety of all job sites. That they will be given the power to actually shut down sectors of work sites according to if there is infection among the workers. So that takes effect as of in a couple of days, and we'll have to see how that all actually pans out. Handing over this official power to these worksite inspectors and see if it slows down the surge of infection, at least in British Columbia, and it could be a model to be used in other areas and countries in order to ensure the slow of infection of COVID-19. So, along with that, while the vaccine is actually out there, most health officials are saying that we still need to do the social distancing, wash our hands, wear a mask, and whenever possible, if we have to meet with people for essential business and things, that we do so outdoors. So let's listen to what the Public Health Office in British Columbia actually has to say with Health Minister Adrian Dix and Dr. Bonnie Henry, the Public Health Officer.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Dix. I'm BC's Minister of Health. To my right is Dr. Bonnie Henry, BC's Provincial Health Officer. This is our COVID-19 briefing for Thursday, April the 8th for British Columbia. honored to be here on the territory of the Musqueam, of the Squamish, of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we thank them for allowing us to do this on their lands. I wanted to note that tomorrow, Friday, we'll be providing a written briefing, an update on COVID-19 cases and other relevant information at approximately 3 o'clock. On Monday, it will be the next in-person briefing with Dr. Henry and myself. In the briefing today, Dr. Henry will be taking you through a presentation on variant of concern testing and severity, by variant of concern and age. Dr. Henry and I will be speaking to some of the measures we're taking along with WorkSafe BC to improve safety of against COVID-19 in workplaces in BC, and I'll be making some comments about our vaccine program. We're going to be leaving plenty of time for questions that we know you have to bring. And with that, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Bonnie Henry.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. For today, to start, we have 1,293 new cases of COVID-19 diagnosed today, bringing the total number of people with COVID-19 in British Columbia to 108,278. I will note that these numbers were reported from our Plover system and may be adjusted once we get our regular system up and running. There was a delay in its refresh today. Of the new cases, 448 were in the Vancouver Coastal Health Region, 645 in the Fraser Health Region, 69 were in Vancouver Island, 80 are people who live in the Interior Health Region, and 51 are people in the Northern Health Region. We currently have 9,184 active cases across British Columbia, of whom 336 are in hospital right now, 101 people in critical care or ICU, and an additional 15,203 people under active public health monitoring. 97,462 people are considered recovered. In the last 24 hours, we've had an additional 2 people who have died from COVID-19 in British Columbia, bringing that total to 1,493. And our condolences continue, and our thoughts go to the people who have lost loved ones. We have one new outbreak at the Seagull Family Health Centre in Vancouver Coastal, and the Ridge Meadows Hospital outbreak is now over. So that leaves us with 4 active outbreaks in long-term care, assisted living or independent living, and 7 in acute care facilities. Just to go quickly, to date we've delivered 995,001 doses of all 3 COVID vaccines across BC, and we know the Get Vaccinated online registration and booking system is now available for people. I'm going to go to the presentation here. As we have we've shared, we're actively monitoring the strains of this virus that we see in British Columbia over the past year, and I'd like to share some of the additional data with you here today. So, as you know, variants of concern are the latest issue that we are looking at, and this has emerged. And I want to put it in a little bit of perspective. So the variants of concern are those variants for which there's evidence that we see from around the world that there's increase in transmissibility, more severe disease, reduced effectiveness of treatments or vaccines, or challenges with diagnostic tests. And as a result, we do know that some of these variants of concern, particularly the ones we've seen from the UK, the B117, are likely to overtake and replace current circulating strains. And we have seen that happen across the world and here in British Columbia. One of the things the goal that we want in terms of what we are looking for with these variants of concern and our surveillance that we're doing in British Columbia, which has evolved over the last few months as we've developed more tests, is to monitor our vaccine effectiveness. That is one of the most important things. monitor the performance of diagnostic tests, and understand the evolution of the viruses that we are seeing causing infections in British Columbia over time, and their impact on things like burden of disease, how many people are getting infected, how many people are in hospital, and how many people have severe outcomes. We also know that existing health measures that have been shown to control all of the strains of the SARS-CoV virus, including the variants of concern, including public health case management, contact tracing, as well as clinical care and infection control measures that we need to take, remain the same, regardless of what strain somebody is infected with. So this is the evolution of what we've seen in British Columbia over the past year, and this is what we call a phylogenetic tree. And we've shown some of these over time in the last few months, and as late as early as last March and April. And what we can see is the number of different strains or slightly different versions of the virus that we have seen in British Columbia has changed, and we've had a much increased number of different strains over the past year. So from March 2020 to March 2021, we've gone from a few dozen to over 100. What we've been looking for, particularly in the last few months, is whole genome sequencing helps us to understand what types of strains are circulating and where in different areas of the province. So this whole genome sequencing has changed over time. We've increased our capacity, so we've done a larger percentage of positive cases, and we have new tests, screening tests, that help us understand when something might be a certain strain or a certain variant. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we do what we call direct PCR to screen for these mutations, and some of those we'll talk. So what we have seen here in British Columbia is that the series of strains that we saw from last summer until early in this year, and you can see that on the bottom of this slide in the colors, they've mostly been replaced, and they've been replaced by a number of different strains. Importantly, we're starting to see a lot of the B117 strain, and that is not unexpected. By the time we recognized that this was a strain that had increased transmissibility, it had already been introduced in British Columbia, and we were able to detect it from very early on. We knew that this was likely to spread more easily and to cause more people to become infected, and we have indeed seen that. And we've seen that this strain has replaced much of the other strains that we've seen. We've also seen a lot of the B12, which is one of the regular strains, not what we consider a variant of concern, but it is one that's been causing a lot of illness over the last few months. The B136 and the 1351 are ones that we were watching carefully as well, and we saw a little bit of them, and then mostly them going away. And most recently, in the last few weeks, we've seen an increase in the P1. And part of that is artifact in terms of we are testing more people that are in clusters that are now related to P1, and the type of screening tests that we've been doing in some labs in the province are designed to pick up that variant in particular. And that's why we are moving to a more systematic surveillance strategy so that we understand the relative importance of different strains and are able to detect new strains as they evolve over time. This is just an example of the numbers of different strains that we found through this whole genome sequencing as of April 4th. And what we call them are lineages, and ones that we want to investigate to see if they do have features that make them more concerning. And I will say that we're not alone. This is something that around the globe people are trying to understand. What is the impact of these different strains? How do we tell if some of them are going to turn out to be more transmissible or cause more severe illness? What are the specific mutations that we need to worry about? And those are all things that are ongoing conversations in BC, in Canada, and globally. And just today, with a number of our lab colleagues, we were on a call across the country to determine what we define as a variant of concern or a variant under investigation, and what criteria we're going to use, and how does that allow us to talk talk to other countries around the world about the variants that they are seeing. I will also say it's really important to know that we do a lot of whole genome sequencing. So we have a better understanding and we have increased numbers relative to many other provinces and in Canada relative to many other countries. We do a lot more proportionately, for example, than the United States in its entirety. And we do very similar proportions of screening and whole genome sequencing to countries like the UK. When we started to see variants here and we started to understand that there were some different mutations that made a difference in that variant being more transmissible in particular. And so this is an example of these different types of mutations that we see with a bunch of different viruses. And these are all profiles, we call them, of variants that we've investigated, that we have concerns about, that were found here in British Columbia in the last few weeks. And what we can see is that many of them share the same mutation that worries us. And the one that has been associated in particular with the UK and with both the South African and the P1 that we saw from Brazil is called the N501Y. So that's a specific mutation that's of concern. As we've learned about these mutations, different laboratories in the province, including the BC CDC, including the lab St. Paul's, and a number of other laboratories, have developed special PCR tests, so these screening tests that pick up those different mutations. But as you can see, those mutations can be with a whole variety of different strains of the virus or different variants. So we do the whole genome sequencing is the only way to tell for sure if it is a Brazil versus a South Africa versus a Philippines. So that is why we have that strategy of doing whole genome sequencing on the screen positive tests. As we've done more, the screen positive tests can be done on the same day, but it's not as specific as we see. In the last few weeks, as we've ramped up our ability to do whole genome sequencing, and as we've developed more and more of these PCR tests, and we've targeted who gets tested with these screening tests as well, we are finding that they are quite accurate and they give us a good sense of the fact that we are seeing quite a rise in the B117. So we need now to shift our strategy so that we can use the whole genome sequencing capacity we have in British Columbia to do more systematic testing and sampling of all of the strains to make sure we're not missing another important one that may be arising. And we don't need to test so much anymore to understand if we have the UK strain here, because it is here and it's increasing and it is causing more transmission in communities around the province. But we're focused right now, we're seeing a lot of it particularly in the Fraser Health region. The P1 was one that was relatively new. We did a lot of focus testing in the early weeks with the chains of transmission and the clusters that were identified with P1. So now we don't need to spend as much time understanding that because we have now seen that strain as well is in a number of chains of transmission around the province, and we need to pay attention to the important measures that we need to take with all of these strains to stop transmission. So as I said, we can't tell with the screening test alone whether it's that exact variant of concern or not, and we need to look at whole genome sequencing in a more holistic way around the province to understand which strains are going to be replacing others, which strains are increasing, and whether there's other concerning ones that are coming now. So our strategy moving forward, given this high rate of transmission or high rate of VOCs that we're seeing in British Columbia, will be to no longer routinely sequence for confirmation. We just assume that those screen positives will be the variants. We assume that anybody who is positive with for COVID-19 needs to be treated as if they have one of these highly transmissible viruses. And we will have a proportion that will be sequenced for continued surveillance over time, so we understand what is changing in our environment over time. And that's what we will be reporting on going forward. And we'll be doing that in a systematic way as part of our weekly surveillance reports from the BC CDC. And that way, our whole genome sequencing capacity can help us understand new transmission chains or clusters or outbreaks, and help us understand how we can best manage those outbreaks, determine the proportion of travelers who have variants of concern, and really importantly, monitor for the things that make a difference in how we are managing our pandemic here in BC. And that is to monitor for reinfections, for vaccine failures, and for what we call escape variants, variants which may not respond as well to our immunization program. So that's an important piece that we have been evolving as we've understood more about the variants of concern in British Columbia right now. The other thing that we have been concerned about and been monitoring very carefully is the rates of hospitalization by age. And we've talked about this, about the fact that we are seeing younger people in higher numbers in our hospitals. But it's important for us to understand if that is higher than we would expect, or if that is because we have increased numbers of people becoming infected and the rate of hospitalization is the same or higher. So when we've done this analysis, we've looked at September to February of 2021, and then the period that we're most concerned about, which is really over the month of March, to see if there has been a difference since we've started to see that increasing rate, particularly of the B117, but also the numbers of P1. And what we can see here is that for the most part, we are not seeing an increased rate of hospitalization by age. The one exception to that is, I think, a reflection of our immunization program, where we have seen a higher rate of hospitalization in people over the age of 80. And this very likely reflects the fact that most of the people over age 80 who were infected with SARS, CoV-2, were people in long-term care. And this reflects the effectiveness of our program and rates going down in long-term care. So people over 80 now, and it's a small number, but this is a rate, so it's a number of infections. And that means that people in the community who are being infected are more likely to be in hospital and to get hospital care, to need hospital care. So I think that's a reflection of the effectiveness of the long-term care immunization. So this is something we will continue to watch very carefully, because this does give us an idea of where the variants are having an effect on people. If we look at the analysis of hospitalization by the people we know have these variants of concern, we have a hospitalization percent of about 4.2% in people who were diagnosed with COVID-19. For people who were not sequence positive, so this is at the time where we were doing sequencing of the high proportion, close to 90%, the hospitalization was about 4%. For people who were identified as having the B117, and that's about 2,300 people, the hospitalization rate was slightly elevated at 5.2%. So that's something we will need to continue to watch. That's about 120 people in March who were hospitalized. And the confidence intervals with people who were not VOC positive is slightly overlapping, but that's a concern. It tells us that we need to continue to watch and to see if the B117 is associated with higher hospitalization rates. The P1 variant, we saw the hospitalizations rates were not elevated, but again, a very small number. So only 36 people were hospitalized with P1 over the month of March. So that's something, again, we need to continue to watch. If we look at the age group of people who've been infected with the variants of concern, the two that we are most concerned about or that we're watching most carefully. What we can see is the B117, it really does reflect people who are the same age bracket as non-VOC. But for the P1, and partly this is because of the testing, and partly it's because of where the chains of transmission were happening, and it's primarily in the Vancouver coastal region, although we've seen clusters in every region, so far not the north. We've seen a much lower age group of people infected. So 20 to 29 and 30 to 39 are overrepresented in the P1. And that's a reflection, again, of where the outbreaks are happening and the increased transmissibility in those outbreaks. So finally, if we look at the rate of hospitalization per 100 cases by variant of concern and age, so putting those two things together, what we see for the B117 is that we are not seeing an increase across most age groups. We've seen a slight increase, as we saw in 80 plus, for people who have the 117 compared to those who don't, but it's very small numbers in that group and a very wide confidence interval. So the gray and the pink, as you can see, so the bar on the left and in the middle are overlap for all of the age groups. But we need to be concerned about the 60 to 69 year age group and the 50 to 59 year age group, where it looks like there might be an increase for both the 117 and the P1. The challenge with the P1, and that's reflected in the very wide confidence intervals, is we're talking about very small numbers of people. So that means that those numbers are unstable, and we can't be for sure, but it's a signal that we will be watching. So there were 10 people in the 60 to 69 year age group that were hospitalized, and 9 people in the 50 to 59 year age group who were hospitalized with a P1 variant. So again, this tells us that we're not seeing a dramatic change in rates of hospitalization by age or by variant, but a signal that we need to continue to monitor, and that's how we will be making sure we're targeting our testing over the next few months. Finally, I just want to talk about how our immunization program and how we can look at proportions of people who are immunized and the effect that we're seeing on hospitalizations and deaths. And what we can see is the 80-plus group, where our immunization program is going very well, and we've targeted that group, had the highest hospitalization rates, the highest rates of death. We've seen a dramatic decrease. Despite increasing numbers and increasing hospitalizations, the impact of the immunization program is felt along all age groups. And that is an important thing for us to remember as we get through the next few weeks and make sure that we get as many people immunized as we can. So to go back to our variants of concern, we will be posting the numbers in the next little while, just of the tests that we have done and by health authority, just so people are continuing to have that information as we transition to doing our more systematic screening and make that part of our weekly surveillance reports. So we do know that we are having increased numbers of people who have been infected with COVID-19, and part of that is, as we just saw, driven by the increased transmissibility of some of the strains that are circulating in BC right now. Workplaces continue to be areas where we have seen ongoing transmission chains and outbreaks and clusters across the province, but particularly in the Lower Mainland, and they are driving some of the transmission that we're seeing. And whether it's some people having, workers having a social interaction and bringing the virus into the workplace and then it's spreading, or whether it's in the workplace itself that the contact is happening. They are one of the most common sources of transmission in our province, and it is widely across many different sectors. We've been working on this with our workplace task group for several months and trying to understand systematically which workplaces are at highest risk and how can we manage outbreaks and clusters in those workplaces. We've been doing this with public health, and our medical health officers and environmental health officers do this every day. And we are targeting businesses. We've been working as well with WorkSafe BC to ensure that enhanced COVID safety plans are in place and that people are adhering to them. In several cases, in many cases, we have had to close workplaces to break those chains of transmission. We've provided immunization in many of the highest risk workplaces that were determined by our workplace group and by the work that we've been doing together, particularly in those workplaces that can't be done remotely. So we've focused on food processing plants, on some of our food distribution plants, the farming areas where people are in group accommodation. So this has been an ongoing program. And part of our ongoing work together has been to work with WorkSafe BC to augment the work of public health. And as part of that program, I'm putting a new expedited workplace closure order in place today. And this order allows WorkSafe BC inspectors to operate under the Public Health Act with guidance from medical health officers to support the work that we're doing in workplaces when there is workplace transmission to help manage those outbreaks. When 3 or more workers have COVID-19 at a workplace that's determined by public health to be transmission in that workplace, we have an outbreak protocol that includes testing, that includes investigation of how that transmission might happen. And when it's determined that transmission has occurred at the location, public health will close that workplace for a period of time, for 10 days or longer as needed, as one of the measures to limit spread in that workplace. In larger workplaces, this closure may be restricted to the locations where transmission has occurred. So one of the places where we see this is at construction sites, and it may just be one team in the construction site that may need to be off for a period of time. We also are working closely with the protocols to make sure that we work with each workplace to provide advice around the COVID safety plans and where transmission events is happening. So when a closure is ordered, WorkSafe BC will now be able to support the work of public health and serve the closure notice and support the workplace to review and enhance their safety plans as needed. We recognize, of course, there are many workplaces that cannot be closed, that for public interests, of course, we need to keep them open and functioning, and those will be under the guidance of public health as well. So such workplaces as police stations and fire halls and our healthcare facilities, transportation hubs, some of the distribution hubs of necessary goods and services, grocery stores, pharmacies, these are places we know we cannot close, but we now have extra resources to help support those workplaces when we have workplace transmission and worker safety is at risk. As part of this as well, we will have a list of workplaces that have been closed and the dates of their reopening, and those will be posted publicly for people. So this is just an ongoing part of our program to help control the outbreaks and a more targeted approach to workplaces across the province to help us make sure that we are keeping things functioning as safely as possible and to avoid the need to have sector closures that are really a blunt tool. In this case, we can keep people working safely, and we can augment the measures already in place and support public health and businesses to control outbreaks and to prevent outbreaks in businesses going forward.
Okay, so we've heard a lot about, of course, inequity in healthcare and how we need to be able to protect everyone. One of the other problems is, of course, actual supply versus demand of the vaccine and needed treatments. Manufacturers have run into production problems because things need to turn around quickly, and which the supply and has been diminished, and shipments have been delayed, and promises to shipments and promises to vaccines have also been delayed. So let's listen to what the Canada Health on the federal level have to say about vaccine and supply.
Thank you very much, and merci, Eric. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's technical briefing on Canada's COVID-19 vaccine rollout. I'm here with Major-General Dany Fortin, Vice President of Operations and Logistics at the Public Health Agency of Canada. We will provide brief remarks and then open the floor to questions. To assist us in addressing your questions, we have with us Joelle Paquette from Public Services and Procurement Canada. To date, more than 7 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered in Canada. Among those people 80 years of age or over, 81% have received their first dose and 10% have received their second. And among those 70 to 79 years of age, 53% have received their first dose and 2% have received their second. Yesterday, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, or NACI, outlined evidence that reinforces their recommendation to extend the time between the first and second dose up to 4 months. Once all eligible populations have been offered their first doses, second doses should then be offered as soon as possible. The rationale for NACI's latest update is that extending vaccine dose intervals will optimize vaccine rollout and allow many more people to gain protection by receiving their first dose of an effective COVID-19 vaccine sooner. Although the vast majority of people in this country were unaware of NACI until only a few months ago, the committee has a long history of providing trusted advice in Canada for more than 50 years. Members of the committee are experts in infectious disease, medicine, public health, epidemiology, immunology, anthropology, and health economics who provide advice on vaccines to ensure the best guidance for the Canadian population. It is important to point out that these experts volunteer their time and expertise to be part of this advisory committee. NACI and Health Canada perform important yet distinct roles. As the regulator, Health Canada authorizes vaccines based on evidence obtained from clinical trials and post-market surveillance. It does not make recommendations on how the vaccine should be used for the best possible public health impact. While NACI reviews the same clinical trial data as Health Canada, it also carefully considers all available evidence about how well the COVID-19 vaccines are working in the real world and applies a public health perspective considering the burden of illness in Canada. Beyond the vaccine characteristics, NACI also reviews mathematical modeling, assesses vaccine supply, and takes into account the programmatic realities of equity, feasibility, and acceptability. NACI is focused on the public health perspective to promote the best outcomes for the greatest number of Canadians as quickly as possible in this pandemic context. Now that NACI has issued its latest full statement on dose intervals for COVID-19 vaccines, it is up to health authorities in the provinces and territories to decide how best to apply it in their immunization programs. As vaccination programs continue to roll out and more scientific information becomes available, we will certainly see further updates and changes in advice and plans. I urge everyone, even after you get your vaccine, to continue to adhere to public health measures such as social distancing, wearing a mask, and washing your hands frequently. These are necessary mainstays in our commitment to preventing the spread of COVID-19 and its variants. And if you haven't done so already, please make a point of finding out when and how you can register to get your vaccine. Your local public health website should have the information you need. Thank you. Bonjour à tous et merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour assister à la séance d'information technique sur le déploiement des vaccins contre la COVID-19 au Canada. Je suis accompagné de Major-General Dany Fortin, vice-président de la logistique et des opérations à l'Agence de la santé publique du Canada. Nous prononcerons quelques mots, puis nous vous donnerons la parole. Pour nous aider à répondre à vos questions, nous sommes accompagnés de Joelle Paquette, des services publics et Approvisionnement Canada. À ce jour, plus de 7 millions de doses de vaccins contre la COVID-19 ont été administrées au Canada. Parmi les personnes de 80 ans et plus, 81% ont reçu leur première dose et 10% ont reçu la seconde. Parmi les personnes de 70 à 79 ans, 53% ont reçu leur première dose et 2% ont reçu la seconde. Hier, le Comité consultatif national de l'immunisation, ou CCNI, a mis en lumière les preuves qui appuient leur recommandation de prolonger jusqu'à 4 mois le délai entre la première et la deuxième dose. Une fois que toutes les populations admissibles auront reçu leur première dose, une seconde dose devrait être offerte dès que possible. La justification de la dernière mise à jour de CCNI est que l'allongement des intervalles entre les doses optimisera le déploiement de la vaccination et permettra à beaucoup plus de personnes d'obtenir une protection en recevant la première dose d'un vaccin efficace contre la COVID-19 plus tôt. Même si la grande majorité des Canadiens n'étaient pas au courant de l'existence de CCNI jusqu'à il y a quelques mois, ce comité de longue date fournit des conseils fiables au Canada depuis plus de 50 ans. Les membres du comité sont des experts dans les domaines des maladies contagieuses, en santé publique, en épidémiologie, en anthropologie et en économie de la santé, qui offrent les meilleurs conseils possibles à la population canadienne. Il est important de souligner que ces experts donnent bénévolement de leur temps et leurs expertises pour faire partie de ce comité consultatif. Le CCNI et Santé Canada jouent des rôles importants mais distincts. En tant qu'organisme de réglementation, Santé Canada autorise les vaccins en se fondant sur les données probantes obtenues au moyen d'essais cliniques et la surveillance post-commercialisation. Il ne fait pas de recommandations sur la façon dont les vaccins devraient être utilisés pour avoir le meilleur effet possible sur la santé publique. Bien que le CCNI examine les mêmes données d'essais cliniques que Santé Canada, il examine aussi attentivement toutes les données probantes disponibles sur la façon dont les vaccins contre la COVID-19 fonctionnent dans le monde réel et utilise une approche portant sur la santé publique étant donné le fardeau de la maladie au Canada. En plus des caractéristiques du vaccin, le CCNI examine des modélisations mathématiques, évalue l'approvisionnement en vaccins et tient compte des réalités programmatiques des principes d'équité, de faisabilité et d'acceptabilité. Le CCNI est axé sur la perspective de santé publique afin de favoriser les meilleurs résultats en matière de santé pour le plus grand nombre de Canadiens et Canadiennes le plus rapidement possible dans le contexte de cette pandémie. Maintenant que le CCNI a mis à jour son dernier énoncé sur les intervalles entre les doses de vaccins contre la COVID-19, il incombera aux autorités sanitaires des provinces et des territoires de décider de la meilleure façon de les appliquer à leur programme d'immunisation. À mesure que les programmes de vaccination se poursuivront et que de plus en plus des renseignements scientifiques seront disponibles, nous verrons certainement d'autres mises à jour et changements dans les conseils et les plans. J'encourage chacun de vous à maintenir les pratiques recommandées par la santé publique, même après avoir reçu votre vaccin. Conservez la distanciation physique, portez le masque et lavez vos mains fréquemment. Ce sont les piliers nécessaires de notre engagement à prévenir la propagation de la COVID-19 et de ses variants. Et si vous ne l'avez pas déjà fait, veuillez vous assurer de savoir quand et comment vous pouvez vous inscrire pour recevoir votre vaccin. Le site web de votre autorité de santé publique locale devrait contenir les renseignements dont vous avez besoin. Je vais maintenant céder la parole au Major-Général Fortin pour son mot d'ouverture. Merci.
Merci, Dr. Njoo. Good afternoon, everyone. To date, we have distributed approximately 10.5 million doses of vaccine to provinces and territories. Over 2 million doses of vaccines have been distributed through Easter weekend and beginning of this week. We received the first shipment from Pfizer-BioNTech for the second quarter of the year this week, totaling a little over 1 million doses, and deliveries to provinces is now complete. As mentioned, we continue to expect that a steady flow of 1 million doses of Pfizer-BioNTech coming in country on a weekly basis through April and May 2021. Quantities will increase in June. Therefore, in the next 3 months, we expect to receive over 17 million doses of Pfizer-BioNTech alone. Deliveries of 590,000 Moderna doses were completed over the past weekend. Our next shipment of 855,000 doses of Moderna are expected to arrive early next week, with onward deliveries to provinces and territories to occur by the end of the week. The following shipment is expected to be around 1.2 million doses, with the delivery into the last week of April. Exact dates of delivery are yet to be confirmed. For AstraZeneca, 1.4 million doses from the facility in the United States were delivered last Saturday to provinces. The remaining doses are being delivered this week for a total of 1.5 million. The COVAX shipment of approximately 317,000 doses of AstraZeneca arrived this morning in Canada. Distribution across the country has started already this morning and is expected to be completed by tomorrow. This is the first shipment from the COVAX facility, and we expect to receive 1.9 million doses from COVAX in this quarter. I want to take a minute to go over supply chains. The distribution of COVID-19 vaccines into and across Canada is an unprecedented operation in scope and complexity. The first step in the process remains the confirmation of the quantity of doses that have been allocated by manufacturer to Canada and an anticipated release date, assuming the doses pass all quality control steps. From this initial notification to the confirmation of allocations with the provinces and territories, and the ordering process, all while ensuring adherence to cold chain requirements, it can take between a total of 7 and 10 days for the vaccine to arrive in Canada and to be distributed to provinces and territories. Delivery time to provinces and territories' designated vaccine distribution site may vary depending on the location. The further from the central hub and the more isolated or rural a region is, the longer the delivery time could be. Generally, however, we're able to deliver vaccines within 2 to 5 days of them arriving in Canada, and provinces then leverage their own distribution systems to further distribute to hundreds of sites across the nation. With over 10 million doses delivered by Easter weekend, we have exceeded our initial objective in the first quarter of this year. This is possible thanks to the hard work of all our colleagues at the federal and provincial and territorial governments, but also of all the healthcare professionals throughout the country. Our distribution tempo will keep on increasing, with around 15 million cumulative doses expected by the end of the month, encompassing Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, and AstraZeneca vaccines. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. À ce jour, nous avons distribué environ 10,5 millions de doses de vaccins aux provinces et aux territoires. Plus de 2 millions de vaccins ont été distribués pendant la fin de semaine de Pâques et en début de semaine. Nous avons reçu le premier envoi de Pfizer-BioNTech pour le deuxième trimestre de l'année cette semaine, pour un total d'un peu plus de 1 million de doses. Les livraisons aux provinces sont maintenant terminées. Comme nous l'avons mentionné, nous continuons de nous attendre à ce qu'1 million de doses de Pfizer-BioNTech arrivent au pays chaque semaine, en avril et en mai 2021. Les quantités augmenteront en juin. Par conséquent, au cours des 3 prochains mois, nous nous attendons à recevoir plus de 17 millions de doses de Pfizer-BioNTech seulement. Les livraisons de 590 000 doses de vaccin, du vaccin Moderna ont été effectuées au cours de la dernière fin de semaine. Notre prochaine livraison de 855 000 doses du vaccin Moderna devrait arriver en début de semaine prochaine. Et les livraisons aux provinces et aux territoires devraient avoir lieu d'ici la fin de cette semaine-là. La prochaine livraison devrait comprendre environ 1,2 million de doses et devrait avoir lieu au cours de la dernière semaine d'avril. Et les dates exactes de livraison restent à être confirmées. Pour le vaccin AstraZeneca, 1,4 million de doses provenant de l'usine de fabrication des États-Unis ont été livrées samedi dernier aux provinces. Les doses restantes sont livrées cette semaine pour un total de 1,5 million. L'envoi de COVAX d'environ 317 000 doses de vaccins AstraZeneca est arrivé ce matin au Canada. La distribution à l'échelle du pays a commencé ce matin et devrait se terminer demain. Il s'agit du premier envoi de COVAX. On s'attend à recevoir 1,9 million de doses de COVAX au cours du deuxième trimestre. Permettez-moi maintenant de prendre une minute pour discuter de la chaîne d'approvisionnement. La distribution de vaccins contre le COVID-19, d'abord au Canada, puis dans l'ensemble du pays, est d'une ampleur et d'une complexité sans précédent. La première étape du processus est la confirmation de la quantité de doses qui ont été attribuées au Canada par un fabricant et une date de distribution prévue, en supposant que les doses respectent toutes les étapes du contrôle de la qualité. De cet avis initial jusqu'à la confirmation des allocations avec les provinces et les territoires, en passant par le processus de commande et tout en assurant le respect des exigences de la chaîne du froid, il peut se passer entre 7 et 10 jours pour que le vaccin arrive au Canada et soit distribué aux provinces et territoires jusqu'aux endroits les plus éloignés. Le temps de livraison au site de distribution des vaccins désignés par les provinces et territoires peut varier selon l'emplacement. Plus on s'éloigne du centre, plus une région est isolée ou rurale, plus le délai de livraison peut être long. En général, nous sommes en mesure de livrer des vaccins dans les 2 à 5 jours suivant leur arrivée au Canada. Les provinces ont ensuite recours à leur propre système de distribution pour les faire parvenir à des centaines d'endroits au pays. Avec plus de 10 millions de doses livrées le lundi de Pâques, nous avons dépassé notre objectif initial au premier trimestre cette année. Cela a été possible grâce au travail acharné de tous les collègues à tous les niveaux de gouvernement, au fédéral, provinciaux et territoriaux, ainsi que tous les professionnels de la santé à travers le pays. Le rythme de distribution va continuer d'augmenter, avec environ 15 millions de doses cumulatives attendues d'ici la fin du mois, d'ici la fin du trimestre, à la fin du mois, comprenant des vaccins de Pfizer-BioNTech, AstraZeneca et Moderna. Merci beaucoup. Je suis maintenant disposé à prendre vos questions.
All right, thank you for listening to Policy and Rights today, and we do this to help protect people's rights, and so we know what the government is actually doing to us, and so that we have a better understanding of what to speak out for, what to speak out against, and how we can all help to make our society better. So, with that, I am going to bring up another potential issue that we actually do not have a recording for, but it is actually happening. In British Columbia, that there has been a surge of taxes, property taxes, that are paid out by small businesses via their commercial leases. For those of you who are familiar with North American business and commercial leases, that there is this thing called triple net, in which case not only do you pay for the square footage of the property that you're using, but you are also paying on part of the maintenance of things to do with the building, the property, such as parking and plumbing, other sort of things that you have to pay a portion of that along with the actual what is paid out by the landlord, or the rest of the tenants that are actually in the structure or the property. So one of those things is actually the property taxes, that you have to pay a certain percentage of the property tax according to the lease. And what is actually happened is, if you go into a lot of mall structures and things like that, that you'll see that there's drop ceilings, where there's empty space between the structural ceiling and the aesthetic ceiling that you actually see. There's a space between the two, and there has been a rash of these taxes that are paid out on that empty space. In which case, some businesses have been had to pay between, one was in excess of $6,000, another was reported and somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars towards this empty space, this vacant space that isn't really possible to be able to use for much of anything either way. The drop ceiling was put there for aesthetic use so that people didn't see the exposed pipes and rafters and things like that, to make the whole thing look maybe a little bit better, to make it just so it looks warm and inviting to customers. So it's something that we need to keep track of and make sure that we are being taxed fairly, and that our small businesses are also being taxed fairly so that they can thrive and keep serving our communities. So, thank you again for listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. My name's Michael Cloggs. I have been your host today, and do look out for your own rights. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.